And I'm an ant with sausage fingers.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. We are your hosts. I'm Jeff.
Hello, I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thank you for joining us for our first anniversary. This episode marks a whole year of us doing Irenicast, which is pretty awesome. We celebrated our 50th, but this is our year anniversary. What's the gift for a year anniversary? Does anyone know?
Paper. I know that.
Paper.
Yeah, I know it's paper. Pretty sure. Because I gave my wife tickets to Wicked on Broadway, our very first anniversary.
That
Pretty
is so
awesome.
romantic. Paper
It was
ticket.
romantic.
Oh,
yeah.
look at you.
And I actually got caught up in the romance. That moment where the witch is like flying and the whole stage is her cape. And I was inspired. It was pretty awesome. Yeah.
So the real question, Alan, is did you really do that? Or did God purpose that? Or did your brain just know that you were going to do that and you had no real
was my biology
choice
speaking
in the matter?
Like, oh.
Yes. Or has this show just been a result of random brain function or divine intervention? And that is the subject we will be tackling today. We are going to be asking the question, do our beliefs on free will affect us?
Not just do we have free will, but does what we think about free will affect how we live?
Yes. And in our segment this week, we're going to be bringing back our Would You Rather game, or whatever we want to call it. So free will. This is, I don't know about you two, but this is kind of the framework or the idea or topic that really, for me, pushed me down the path of theological inquiry, and that really started kind of getting my mind flowing as far as there's more to Christianity, the Bible, and theology than I've been hearing in church and in Sunday school.
Really?
So to me, this is a fun issue. Yeah, this is a really
There's more
pivotal
in the
issue,
universe.
specifically around Calvinism, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit. But that was kind of like, because I was in a mode of evangelicalism that was charismatic, so free will was important, and I dedicated a lot of time and reading and effort to disprove that Calvinism was a thing. So anyway, that's
So Calvinism in the
one.
sense of John Calvin and the institutes from like the 1500s talking about predestination, right? That's what you mean by Calvinism. Tulip.
That's actually, it's not very Calvinist.
Really?
It's more
That's what everybody
Calvin
says. That's the in thing to say. Calvinists aren't even really Calvinists because John Calvin was different. And maybe that's true.
Well, have you read the Institutes? Because he doesn't talk about...
actually, I did have a pastor that made me buy them.
He talks about
I shouldn't
providence
say
a lot,
this,
but it's
but-
not the same concept as what we think about as predestination. And a lot of us. Luther hated free will, so a lot of it's from Luther too. And Calvin was influenced by Luther, so...
Hated. He stayed up at night, angry. Wish I could give this up.
I feel like that most of Martin Luther's life was staying up at night,
Oh my
being
gosh.
angry,
Oh, yeah.
So the
nailing things to doors and burning down villages.
the
he
debate
was
you're
a
referencing,
guy. He was an interesting guy.
the debate you're referencing is just the question: do we respond to God's like invitation to relationship freely of our own accord, or does God draw us beforehand and woo us in the sense that we have less of a free will to respond? We're predestined for it. So I think that's what you mean by Calvinism. So you grew up in a church context where the free choice of responding to God was so important that you had to disprove some of the theological stuff that other people talked about. Right, Jeff? That's what you're...
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Why'd you have to disprove that?
Yeah, I'm curious about this.
Because I was young and brash, and whenever I thought
young and
something was
brash.
right, I needed to disprove everyone else as being wrong. That's why.
I
You
don't
are
mean...
a contrarian. It's
I
true.
am, and that's part of my nature, is that I don't, sometimes it's on purpose and sometimes not.
Well, what I mean is like not you as a person, but why did you feel it was necessary for your charismatic theology to prove that you had this free will to respond to God? Was it like because the invitation's so important? Like it's so important to respond to God that you had to protect that freedom to do so?
No, it had nothing to do with God.
What did it have to do with? Well, you said it was theological.
Well, if I was going to believe something, I wanted to make sure that I was right. And I would say that that's true for all of us. Like I'm the type of person that I'm not going to just believe something blindly. Part of my contrarian nature, but then also just I knew this was something or an idea that I was going to put my life into, which I eventually did. And I wanted to make sure that I was confident in what I believed because I saw too many people around me that weren't. And not, well, I saw a lot of people that were confident in what they believed, but not informed so much in what they believed.
So today we're talking, we talked about this a lot ahead of time. Like, do we talk about just, is there free will or not? The classic question that philosophers have been talking about for 3,000 years, back to the Greeks. Or do we talk about how that question affects us? Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty different scope, right? So what you're talking about, Jeff, is like how that question affected your theology and the way people around you acted. And that's what we're really interested in talking about today.
Because we could cite philosophers that believe one way or another, or theologians that believe one way or another. There's whole books that are written about them. And even the scientific community, probably like science and psychology, has been really interested in whether we have free will or not. There's this guy who was really well known, Ben Libet, in 1985, that did some studies and came to the conclusion that we don't have free will. Our bodies just respond, and then thought comes later to explain it. And now there are German scientists that are saying, well, actually, we have the ability to modify the way we even respond to the biological impulses. Anyway, all that to say that there are really good scientific reasons to believe one way or the other. And instead of parsing all the differences between those, we're going to see how it actually impacts a community of faith or our personal theology. Because I grew up in a very different background, apparently. I grew up in a very Calvinistic setting. Are you saying that yours wasn't, Jeff? You guys were not Calvinistic?
Not at all.
Okay,
no.
we were. I remember in my Bible college days, I said I was thinking about, Arminianism as in like we can respond to God freely of our own free will. That's an important choice versus this predestination. You have no choice. You're either going to be a Christian or not, and that's determined before you're born. I said I was questioning which side I was on, I guess, or what I believed. And people thought even questioning Calvinism was like destroying the gospel because you're destroying the concept that God is in control. To say that,
which is super ironic because
yeah, I can't help it, man. I mean, like the joke was, if somebody got really upset about this conversation, you just punch them in the face and then say, "I'm sorry, I couldn't have done any differently, even if I wanted to." So, if we're going to talk about free will, we need to clarify at least two things. We're not saying free will is the ability to do anything you want, because like in a football game, there's certain rules, right? You can make a decision to run the ball or throw the ball, but you can't like all of a sudden say the touchdown's over here and totally change all the rules.
No, you can though.
Well, we can't fly. I right now, even if I wanted to, I couldn't just levitate off the ground and fly in the air like Superman.
Well, yeah, but I didn't think that was on the table.
But within, yeah, I'm just clarifying some things. Within a certain bounds, we have freedom to make decisions, and free will is defined as the ability to have been able to have chosen otherwise. When you come up to a choice, free will is you have the option for real of being able, you are able to choose one way instead of another. So if you look back over your life and you see these choices, you're like, I could have done something differently. It's entirely possible. So that's what free will is. And
maybe regret is a source for free will. Belief. No, it's interesting. And this is made further interesting by scientific discovery, because you'll meet very few people these days who will argue we have so much free will that we can just disregard our cultural, social location, and we can just like almost what Alan said, like just fly if we want to. Like we are predisposed by our environments, like to a heavy degree.
And by our own physical bodies too. Our bodily processes determine even a lot of our thoughts and things like that. So if you have people in the scientific community that argue for free will, it's on top of the idea that we are predisposed through all of these factors, that we don't have free will until a certain point, and then something arises that allows us to make decisions. So we're very conditioned.
But that's been chipped away at, though, the fact that we do have choices. Mm-hmm. Like there's a whole new scientific area called epigenetics, which I recently heard about a study about lab mice being conditioned to fear cherry tree blossoms. And the mice
As
were
well they should.
cherry blossoms are terrifying. So the mice were unfortunately given shocks whenever, to operantly condition them to fear cherry blossoms. So the mice had this experiment done on them and were instilled with the fear of cherry blossoms. And then they gave birth to another generation of mice. Those mice were afraid of cherry blossoms. And not only those mice were afraid of cherry blossoms, but their children were afraid of. So to the second generation, you could genetically pass on fear, which is bonkers if you think about it. And it's funny because I've been thinking about this a lot lately because, in the Pentecostal tradition I was raised with, and some of us were raised with this, that the ideas of generational blessings and curses, like there's passages, I think like in Isaiah, the sins of the father will be passed on to more generations, like to the fifth generations, but blessings will be passed on for more generations. And a lot of people are like concerned about ancestry and why does ancestry matter? And why do we have a craving to know where our ancestors came from and what they did and how that affects us today? So there are a lot of people saying like there's emerging science that shows that we're way more conditioned psychologically and subconsciously than we even realize.
Yes, but the most recent, I think, cutting edge thing is actually rethinking that divide. So for a long time, since the 80s, science and psychology has said we probably don't have free will. Most likely not. There's not a consensus whatsoever, but that's the direction it went. But lately, there's been the idea that even though, given all of the conditioning, given that our DNA determines so much about us and our brain chemistry does, we still have the ability to respond and tamp that down to a certain extent. It's not as much power as we thought before, and it's much more conditioned, but there still is an element of thought that controls those upward processes.
So can we resist compulsion? And
No, you have the compulsion. Yeah. Okay.
Can you resist or can you engage with compulsion? Are you ruled by compulsion or can you engage with it? And
I like to think of it as the car that drives by and splashes you with mud, right? Like the impulse control. Your impulse right away is, man, that guy's a jerk. He went out of his way. He swerved off the road, hit a puddle and splashed me. Now I'm super angry. But then you look and you see someone on the middle of the road, this kid playing with a ball, and you realize he swerved out of the way. You start immediately, because of a thought you have in your brain, to control your biological anger response. It immediately begins to affect that upward process that led you to where you were at. So we do have some sorts of impulse controls. The question is that thought me? Like, am I the one? The question of identity, and like, it gets really philosophical, but I think in a religious context, instead of just asking all the philosophical questions, we have to ask, what is it like to deny that people have a real choice when it comes to moral decisions or when it comes to decisions about their own faith? Because I was taught that we don't have free will. We are a complete slave to sin, is what I was taught, until you become a Christian. Then when you become a Christian, you have the freedom to respond to God. But you don't have that freedom until God allows you to have that freedom and you become one. So we were taught that people are slaves everywhere, all over the planet. I even used SpongeBob as an example when I was a youth pastor, that like there's a episode of SpongeBob where the antagonist, forgot his name, he's a little flea, and he like sells these buckets, right, full of burgers, and everybody gets a free bucket with their meal, and then all of a sudden they don't realize, but the buckets like clamp down on their head, and now they're all slaves, right? And I used to say sin is like that. Sin enslaves us. There's an element of that is true. There are evil in our world when we participate in it gain some sort of power, and we give it power, like culturally. That's true. But I saw it in like a spiritual sense. This is what I was taught, that you are a slave to sin. You can't choose God at all. You can't choose good at all until you become a Christian and you're given this newfound sense of freedom. So speaking about free will was important to us because it helped us determine like who was in, who was out, how much control God had over the world. And it gave me these really weird ideas about God. Weird in my sense now that I think about it. It gave me weird ideas about what worship was, what God wanted from me. And it took me a long time to realize that, relationship with God is not like a dictatorship. Yes, God's in control and God created the universe, but I do believe God's love for the universe has given people freedom to respond, or even the universe, however you want to define it. The whole universe has some sort of creaturely freedom, and we cannot give in a relationship what we don't own. I really do believe this. This is what it comes down to for me. It's not about science or philosophy or whatever. In my own relational experience with God, if I don't own myself and my decisions, how the hell can I give that to God in a relationship in response? I can't.
Oh, you're raising so many different questions there, Alan. Yeah. I don't even know how to parse all that out. But
you don't have to. That's my experience. You don't have to.
So I guess the core question is, are we asking, do our beliefs on free will affect the way that we live? Yeah. And when I hear your scenario, Alan, and then when I've talked to other people who are vehemently, Calvinists, whatever we want to call it, but that believe they don't, they're whatever word you want to use, that they don't have any agency or anything like that. They're the very ones that are so intent on enforcing choice on everyone else.
Yes.
Like, and the whole basis of not having free will or having free will comes down to a choice of choosing God, which makes on one level no sense to me, whatever. And I think, how can this belief that you have no choice really be affecting the way that you live, when the way that you live is trying to dictate choice for everyone else around you?
And I know that's semantics. It was like,
those are different issues, I think, Jeff, that you're parsing out.
No, it's true though. There is an element of, like, to me, hypocrisy in what I was taught. Some people would say that God ordains everything in the world that happens. Every single thing that happens in the world, God planned it and God wanted it to happen.
So that's a question of providence and sovereignty, not necessarily free will.
Those two things impact each other, because we were taught that God wanted you to have free will, right? So this is what some people believed. God wanted you to have free will. So it's all planned out, but your plan and free will is still God's, like, direct action.
There are
layers of questions.
Layers of questions. But I think one of the biggest things for me in answering the question, how does your view of free will impact the way you move around in the world and the way you see God? Because I've heard many different types of the argument that you were making before, Alan, which is interesting. So everybody in the way they grew up or what they've heard argued, that it might vary differently. I've heard people argue that sovereignty and not having free will is the ultimate faith in God's goodness, and that's very comforting for them. So, but I've also heard that God is so beautiful and God's beauty is so compelling, and God appears to only some people, the elect, and therefore when we respond to God, it's not actually our choice. It's God giving us the grace to make the choice that if we can take a step toward God, and this is Luther's original argument, if we can even take one step or even think about taking a step toward God, then we're not acting in grace and we're not accepting the gift of God in grace, because we're doing something on our own. And therefore Luther would say it's like utter blasphemy to think that we can even take a step toward God or even think about taking a step toward God.
You're talking about the theological term prevenient grace, that God enables you to make that step, that you can't do it without God's enabling.
Right. So I was trying to cite that as kind of an example of how your view on free will or not having free will might affect how you see God. That, you have to grapple with the idea of what kind of God would only reveal God's beauty to some people and not others, if God's beauty is utterly compelling and it kind of evaporates the myth of free will in the glory of God. So then you have to answer a different set of theological questions. If you do believe in free will, you answer another set of theological questions. So it has these weird ripple effects throughout. And if you see God in a certain way, then you will walk around in the world differently and act differently, probably. Like, if you see God as ultimately good and God's sovereignty is ultimately good, then you're going to tell people, like, I'm sorry that horrible thing happened to you, but it's for the best,
How do you see God now, Jeff? You've talked about your process. How do you see God now in this question with free will? Does God give people free will? Can you tell me one way or the other?
You know what? I think we've kind of touched on this before. I don't remember which episode, but the idea that I don't think God has really anything to do with it, in the sense that to say that a belief informs how we live, to me, is backwards. Where I believe how we live informs how we frame our beliefs, and that our experience are much more powerful than our worldview, and that our worldview comes from our experience as opposed to our experience and actions coming from our worldview. So when someone says they believe in free will, my question is, well, how does that affect the way that you live? My question is, how did you come to that conclusion? Because I will have a better picture on how you live. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So did God give me free will? I don't know. I would say if you were going to pin me down, I would say I believe that less than I used to. Maybe I've even come full circle because some of the neuroscience is compelling to me. Like you mentioned just in passing the Libet experiment.
Yeah.
Or is that how you pronounce it?
I don't know.
But that, his idea was like he kind of set up this test for movement and that then, measured the brainwaves. So the brainwaves tell us that before the decision to move was made, the brain was already prepping for the move.
People had their arm, they had their brain strapped up to a machine, and they were told when you see the light or whatever, move your arm. And so their arm would move before they consciously reported, like milliseconds before they consciously reported making the decision. So it's almost like their body reacted and then their brain said, oh yeah, that's what I meant to do. And like after the fact, put will as some way to make sense of what their body was doing. So he questioned the whole idea of your body's responding to the world around you and it's just an illusion that you're even determining anything at all. And so that's what he said there. Now the second thing was the Germans said that when that happens, they had a second impulse thing where someone stopped moving their arm, and it's really complicated, but they're questioning whether that's been accepted as like a almost gospel by neuroscientists since 1985. So there's an element of truth to it.
So we have like centers of knowledge and pathways of knowledge that sometimes circumvent language centers or consciousness centers of the brain.
And it's what Jeff's talking about. It's like your experience gives rise to your beliefs.
And trauma studies are super interesting in this way too, because trauma experts say that trauma experiences that's the person who is a victim constantly suffers over and over again. Those experiences and those memories actually get locked into pre-linguistic parts of the brain, and you can only access them like through bodily functions that are non-linguistic and non-cognitive in a lot of ways. That's why a lot of trauma therapy is moving more toward like dance therapy and engaging people's bodies to help express or unlock it sounds like mumbo jumbo science, but it's interesting to think about how experiences of trauma really shape our experiences of living in the world without our consciousness being involved. So that's another whole element to this.
Yeah, and you have sociological concerns like corrupt systems, how they affect choice and everything like that. So for me, for anyone to say we have 100% free will or not free will is misguided, because there's so many elements and so many things that are influencing our choice. But I guess it boils down to ultimately, is it our choice? And I don't know if that's a God thing, because really, even someone who's a determinist, who believes that we have absolutely no free will and that everything we do is,
whether theologically or scientifically, right? Whether they're materialism determinist or not.
I've never met any one of and I could be wrong, and maybe there are people out there, but I've never met and I've never read about anyone who actually lives that way. They still live under the illusion of free will. They still pick their breakfast cereal. They still pick which coffee they're going to make. Like, whether or not free will exists, we still all live as though free will exists.
Well, at least in our part of the world, in our time in history, that maybe that's a lot of the fallout of consumerism is you have choices. Look how fun these choices are for you. And maybe that really does contribute to a larger system that keeps us thinking like consumers and acting like consumers. Maybe.
It does impact, however, on the theological realm, what I think about God and what I think about other people. If people who have no choice whether they can do good or bad, we infantilize people who are not Christians in one way or another. These people have no agent. We take away their agency. I think, religiously speaking, yes, it makes no difference, Jeff, on an individual level, on a day-to-day basis. If you're like a materialist, a scientific determinist, you think everything is just physical processes. It doesn't necessarily impact your choices. But to tell a whole group of people, like theologically speaking, God determines everything that happens, you start saying things like that tornado hit the planet because God determined it. That person made those choices because God determined it. And you condition entire groups of people like me become conditioned to think that we have less agency than we thought we did. So we're easier victims than people who are, it's like with a kid. Teaching a kid you have power to make decisions, right? this is something we talked about before. Teaching a child that you have power to say no is an important element in becoming like a healthy adult, right? But if you train a kid to like say that they have no power, they have no agency, it really affects them on a psychological level. And
wait, we got to stick to one topic at a time, if you don't mind. I'm having trouble. Like,
sorry. Okay. Yeah.
You have to parse free will from tornadoes. Those are not the same thing. So you got to either talk about free will and our agency, or providence and sovereignty.
So one of those things, it determines, this question matters about what I think about God on the one hand, and it matters about what I think about myself on the other. I think that if you think that you don't have a free will for one way because of science or whatever, it doesn't necessarily impact how you live, maybe. But I have seen theologically, when you're told you don't have free will, it affects you psychologically and theologically. It affects.
But see, that to me, that goes to someone else imposing on you, like you as a person. Like, for example, and this is why I am where I'm at. Like, Alan, knowing you, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have always, as long as I've known you, you've had this incredibly deep desire for the best for the people around you, and even beyond that sphere.
Yes.
And that has been your constant.
Sure.
And I think that everything that you believed comes down to that. So at a time when you believed that the world was this, you believed because that was the best, because God, and I'm just making general assumptions. And now you're on the other end of free will, where that core of who you are hasn't changed. You've just figured out a new philosophy to kind of attach to that better fits that core of who you are. And that's how I think we work, is that someone who's putting that idea of control, whether they believe free will or not, who they are, for whatever reason, is controlling, or they
Yeah, but it couldn't be any other way. Like, we are who we are, and we think what we think because of who we are. Like, yes, I understand that there's reasons for why we believe what we believe, but just looking at like the causative effect of one theology versus the other, like what kind of damage it does. Because of my background, I have a unique view of the damage that telling groups of people they don't have free will actually does to them.
No, and that's valid. I don't think we're trying to say that. What I was trying to say, though, is like earlier, is that you experience one iteration or one version of predestination.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's important to tease out.
Neo-Calvinism is what a lot of people call it.
Yeah, because I know people who are Calvinists and determinists and don't believe that God sends tornadoes to punish people. So there's variety in that, and we don't want to flatten this too much, right?
Okay.
But I do agree with what you're saying, though. It does have implications.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For me personally, and that's all I can speak to.
But like you said, that has less to do with the philosophy and the person communicating it. Because you can have the same philosophy depending upon who and how it's communicated. It provides different results.
Yeah, because I had a certain personality, it was crushing. It's funny, I just read a book recently where in 1905, Edith Wharton wrote this book, and she said, for this one guy, virtue actually became a vice, and prudence was actually like a horrible thing for this person to embrace because of their personality. To hear things like be humble, my personality, to hear growing up you need to be humble in youth group actually hurt me. There are some people that don't need to hear that. They need to hear the opposite. So I get what you're saying. Being told you don't have free will might not affect one person, but it affects another person very deeply. I understand that, and I personally am affected by that just because of the way I'm wired.
Yeah.
But
context is super important.
But regardless, it still says something powerful about God. If God created a universe where there is no free will, and I think my free will is attached to, that's why I talk about tornadoes. My free will is attached scientifically to the free will of the universe. If there is not some sort of freedom in the universe for things to evolve and for things to happen, it's hard for me to see myself outside of that, because I do believe we're a product of this process. And so if there is no free will in the world at all, if God has determined everything that will happen, what does that say about God? You know what I mean? There's some powerful implications about what we think about what God is.
Yeah, I think of the political definition of power as not as domination, but as the ability to affect change. As a lot of people will define it that way. And I think it's interesting to think about it in terms of that definition, this whole conversation. I do think a lot of times we do have a myth or an illusion of power to affect change. But at the same time, I don't think who we are is fixed. I think we create who we are every single day to a large degree, to a much larger degree. Like whether we are conscious of it or not, we're choosing to participate in cultural norms and social norms. We're choosing to get out of bed. We're choosing to go to work. We might be heavily compelled, but we do have alternatives. So I think that does affect the way that you act and see in the world. For example, what if the people leading civil rights had decided, we really don't have that much choice involved. Like you either have to say that God compelled civil rights to happen and basically like moved everybody around like robots, which I don't know, that could be possible. Or you have to say that like in that political moment, people decided that they were going to try to shape a different reality, even to the demise of their own person.
Or that God inspired them and they responded.
Or that God inspired and then they chose to respond, right?
I think it's interesting. This comes to a head for me when we talk about disaster. I remember Jeff going through this process because I did too. Jeff and I have known each other for 10 years and we were both in, we were both in the evangelical setting from different perspectives coming at this question. And we talked about it quite often. And I remember thinking like every bad thing that happens in the world, every bad choice a human being makes can be attributed to the feet of God because God knew it was going to happen. And if God knew the ambulance was going to run someone over and didn't pull them out of the way or whatever, whether God acted or not, God still had the power to, and God chose not to. That said something about all the bad things in the world. They're actually good because they're ordained by God. When tragedy happens, we could just say, oh, but God planned it. God wanted it this way, and it was good. And there was no room in the grieving process, in my opinion, to be able to say, no, this is bad.
Again,
this should not
that's
have
a
happened.
providence and sovereignty thing, not a free will thing.
It is. It is a free will thing, though.
How?
Say a human being makes a decision to do something wrong.
No, you're talking about accidents.
No, let's just talk about a human being doing something wrong.
Okay.
That was an example about God stepping in or not, right? Someone chooses to kill somebody.
Okay.
Right? If this was free will, you could just say that sucked and that person did something wrong and it should not have happened. And God didn't want it to happen.
Right.
But if that person doesn't have free will, theologically speaking, God ordained that to happen. It may be comforting that God is in control, but then it says something about that situation. It's no longer a moment. You can't afford to step back and say that should not have happened. And God is upset about this.
Well,
you can't say that, right?
No, you.
That's why I think it's problematic to bring God into the situation because you are trying to.
But it's what matters. What matters to me and people in belief contexts where God is very important to their lives.
No, hold on. I want to be devil's advocate for a minute. What you said earlier, Alan, is that you said that the saving work of Jesus gives people access to free will so they can choose to the good.
That's what I was taught growing up.
Yeah, but actually in your example of someone killing somebody, you could say that they are acting out, if you believe that theology, that they are acting out.
I don't believe that theology.
Hold on. Just let me talk. You could say that person who's murdering someone is acting out their carnal nature because of the fall and that they don't have the free will to do good because they have not been enacted upon by grace yet. So actually that theology is consistent. You don't have to agree with it, but it actually does make sense. And you could still say, and you could still say that God is, you could still say
God determined it. You know what I mean?
No, I don't think there are very few Calvinists who believe that God would determine and cause someone to kill somebody else. That's a very, very fringe view. You could still say that because that person who murdered was not free in Christ to do good, that God is grieved by that act and God didn't want it to happen. Like you could still, that's a soft determinism, but I'm trying to say that there's shades of this in between.
There are, but I think the way that it was taught to me growing up, you were taught to see all things as good, right? Job had all his kids die in the Bible because wind kept hitting the house, but he could still tear his cloak and say, God is good. God, and we were taught in the sense that because God's in control, it may seem bad, but it's really good because God has a plan. And like those kinds of things to me interrupt the grieving process. And
I think that's hugely dangerous. And I have also heard of a study recently being done on people who hold neo-Calvinistic views. And there's a pretty strong data correlation between that and domestic violence. Like basically suffering is for the best. And so we're going to even not only allow suffering to happen, but also call it good. And I think that what you're saying, Alan, like you're hitting on something super, super important.
And it's all connected. You can't just parse it out. It's all like deeply interwoven in theology and psychology.
Yeah.
At least in my brain.
Yeah. And for me, I read it feministically too, because it tends to be communities who hold these beliefs, who are also very complementarian, who do uplift male authority as being more supreme than female authority or female agency. And that holds huge problems for gender-based aggression. So, yeah, I mean,
it's freeing to hear Jeff in those moments to say that maybe God didn't want that to happen. God doesn't actually determine all the actions of individuals, you know?
What did you say in those moments, Jeff?
Back then,
I don't remember.
Back then.
Let me get this point out real quick. Okay. So all of that is great because you're hypothesizing a situation where someone gets killed or someone dies or whatever. But when someone in your family is finally killed and you are now experiencing that situation, none of that makes a difference. Maybe the free will argument, like you guys are talking about, does affect like an overall society change as far as how things move forward. But in that moment, the decisions that you make are almost never consistent with the philosophy that you have. Because how many times and how many stories in those contexts when people walk away from the faith or backslide or whatever we want to call it, it's a result of some kind of tragedy that doesn't fit what they believe, because in that moment, they know more and realize more about themselves because it's unfiltered. So like all that's great and nice, and you can put an either or situation in that scenario where someone dies or gets killed or you're hurt by someone, but it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't.
It does. It doesn't
Why
matter
doesn't it
to
matter?
you. Hey, if you want to start talking about people's personalities, I'll just say, Jeff, because your beliefs don't affect you to that degree, you can say that. But to somebody whose beliefs actually affect the psychology in their brain, like I do believe that people's beliefs temper how they respond to a situation. I know people who respond to tragedy very differently because they believe God is in control. It really does have this top-down sort of effect on who they are. And if they think that God's not determining it, it's scary for them. You know what I mean?
It's scary for me, and I don't believe that God's
I think that
determining
situation
it.
is way too nuanced to make a call either way on what that person is and how that philosophy has influenced where they're at.
But whole community,
and that's my problem
though,
with
right?
all of this.
No?
Wait, what?
But you can say how a whole community responds to tragedy. The words we choose to say, like the stuff that the community says about a tragedy, is affected by how, like, I've seen
You're talking
pastors
about
get
comfort
up.
mechanisms. Then.
Yeah, I see pastors get up and say, like, not making any excuses, not even saying God like wanted this to happen, you know, or there's no like silver lining necessarily, that God is grieving with us too about this.
Maybe what I'm
decision.
saying is that it's much easier to shift the focus of a group of people than it is an individual.
Yeah.
So in that scenario, I think you can mobilize a group of people and influence a group of people and their philosophies as they move forward. But an individual is less likely to follow that because different circumstances may arise or may.
I think it's hard to say that for certain, though. I mean, I think it depends on the person. But I don't know. To say that it just doesn't matter, I think
it doesn't matter in terms of free will. Like it doesn't matter in terms of like, does what I believe specifically about free will, is that the worldview that's affecting my decision in this moment?
It did to me.
It may be a part of it, but I don't think that we can say that any one issue by itself informs the decisions or the reactions that we have to life.
I think it's super important for processes of forgiveness and grief, though. Like, how do you, if you believe in a form of determinism, like scientific determinism, you might have more compassion for the killer because the killer had trauma, or the killer had been abused, or the killer had witnessed something that, or had a psychological issue or a mental issue. You know what I'm saying? Like there are a lot of forms of this that do matter.
Maybe the reason I brought my own personal anecdote is because I think it brings it into sharp relief what I'm trying to say and where I think we disagree. The reason I bring God into this is because it affects my relationship with God. There is a moment, actually, and no joke, I was on like a treadmill at the moment in the gym when I had this like ever before and ever after in my faith. Before that moment, I honestly thought that I had no control in my relationship with God, and I was just responding to the love of God. God wooed me, and I didn't have any sort of participation or agency. I really didn't think I had that. I even resented, like in Mark Twain, there's this, I think it's Huckleberry Finn. There's a guy standing on top of a roof, and he's sitting in a chair or something, and he has a shotgun, and he says, I I get pissed whenever anything brings a man to his knees. You need to be self-determined. That's the only true way to be a human. I remember reading that and it speaking to me, but being so appalled at it theologically. Like, that's horrible. That should not be a part of our conception, because we need to be ultimately humble. God is in control. My faith up to the point of being on that treadmill was like, I am literally have no part in this. I am just at the whim and will of God when it comes to my relationship with God and my relationship with the world. At that moment, though, I finally had the realization of why that spoke to me and where I was led up to theologically. A moment when I embraced the fact that I do have choice, that God has created in me a creaturely freedom that is totally conditioned, but a creaturely freedom to, yes, respond to God or not, changed my relationship with God and changed the way I do ministry. So that move in philosophy, Jeff, you might say that happened because of other reasons or whatever, but at least for me, thinking philosophically, like it changed the way that I relate to God. Like I have a responsibility to bring myself to God in a totally different way, and I experience God's love in a different way now. It's not love in the sense that I experienced before, but love in the sense that freedom is love. It looks like not just controlling power, but giving somebody the freedom to respond. Anyway, it's a very powerful moment for me, and I think it determines things.
True. 100% agree.
That's why this conversation sucks, is because it's almost like
we bit off a big
circular
one.
Reasoning.
We did, yeah.
We bit off a big one.
But that's story. It's beautiful.
Whether you're on one side or another, you're right, Jeff. There is an element that it is almost semantical, because it's almost an exercise in intangible philosophy. And I think that's both like why you've resisted it. But I do believe embracing one way or another does make a difference in your life.
Yes. And well, I think it does. The determinism does cause us to have this cosmic insecurity. And actually, this has been documented by people who study Protestantism. Like Luther's insecurity, for example. Luther talked about in his giant tome against Erasmus and against free will, when he made that argument, like we can't even think about taking a step toward God. Like he wrote that the soul is basically a beast of burden, a pack animal that any rider can ride at any moment, either God or the devil, and we never quite know which one. We can never know which one. So we have to trust that we're being led in the goodness of God with absolute non-clarity. And so I think it causes this insecurity of our soul, because it causes us to be constantly like trying to discern, but never knowing completely whether what we're doing is good or not. But I think that can cause some problems. Like, for example, I'm waiting to hear back to see if I can get into PhD programs. And I've been like losing my mind with anxiety because I don't have a security of a belief structure that says the best thing will happen. Sometimes the best thing doesn't happen. Sometimes you don't get into the program that you feel like was your calling or your destiny. It just doesn't. And so it's easier for me to believe in cosmic chance and dice rolling than to believe that God would withhold something good from me. And I think so I'm thinking of this instance with my mom. We were sitting in the car and we were arguing about prosperity gospel. And that's an idea of free will, right? Like you sow your resources into God's economy and God blesses you, but you do it. Like you're the one who takes initiative and God blesses you as a result of your faithfulness, right? That really does come out of like free will theology. And so we were arguing and she's like, well, sometimes God just blesses me. And I just know that God blesses me. And I said, well, what about all the people who starve every day and can't feed their kids? Like, does God not bless them? Does God not love them enough? For me, determinism breaks down at that point. And so we were arguing back and forth about this. And she goes, no, it only works in the positive. It's only if you get blessed, it's God. If you're not blessed or you lack, then
that's
it's not
single
God.
predestination. People would believe God predestines people to blessing, but not to punishment. That's similar.
No, she didn't believe she's a total free will person. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, so these are where concepts of sovereignty blend into free will. But people who believe in prosperity gospel actually believe that they take the initiative to sow into God's economy and they are directly blessed for their free actions, right? Okay, so that's what we were talking about. Anyway, as we're debating this, I kid you not, a $5 bill floats down the road about 2 feet from the side of the car. And my mom's like, see, God sent that dollar bill to tell you that I'm right. And I was like, oh my God. And
Suck
I'm like,
it, Mona.
I'm losing my crap over
That's
this.
awesome.
And so,
okay. So that I think that you're right, and I think that everyone's right and wrong in this situation. But okay, so for me, it comes down to The Matrix, and let me explain.
Always.
I think the unsung hero of The Matrix is Cyrus, who says ignorance is bliss, regardless of what the truth is, because none of us will never know. Maybe we'll have a better idea depending upon what is researched or whatever. Our beliefs in moments of tragedy are there to bring us comfort. And if they're not bringing us comfort, then it puts us into a place of deconstruction or whatever we want to call it that pushes us into some other belief that will help frame that. Our brain does it when we look back on past experiences. Our future experiences begin to reshape what that whole thing looked like. And if in a moment a certain philosophy gives me hope, then great, amazing, and I will look back on that and I will be thankful for that.
What if God gave you that philosophy, Jeff, to believe in?
What's that?
What if God gave you that philosophy to be comforted by?
It looks like
And it was
avoidance.
determined.
Fine.
Sometimes it's psychological.
And if I want to believe that a $5 bill is a blessing from God and it gives me hope in that moment, that's fine. But I can still have that same experience and another belief that gives me just as much hope, if not more. And it's flowing. It's always back and forth. So I don't know. That's why for me, it always goes back to what comes first, the belief or your desire to have belief or feel comfort. And I think it's the other way around. And I think that the philosophy is inconsequential compared to the reason you're adopting that philosophy.
The reasons definitely matter. I mean, I think we
affect each other so deeply, though.
So are we saying
they matter more?
Will affect other people.
Wait, so are we saying that our views on predestination of free will are conditioned because
That's what he's saying.
That's
what I'm saying.
That's a predetermined argument.
Yeah, and I would say I'm much more predeterminist than I used to be, but I might not be tomorrow if it helps.
Scientifically predetermined, though, right? You're saying, like, scientifically speaking, not a theological.
But then ultimately God, because I believe that God has some level in that. That's what I'm saying is that, and Alan, that's why I think for as long as we've known each other, when we have these conversations, which is proof from this conversation, you like to jump in and put a definition on what we're talking about. Here is what you mean by this. Here's the term. And I've never been comfortable with that because for me, maybe this is, again, just my nature, which probably goes more towards my argument, but to put something in a box or definition means, for me, it restricts me from changing in the future.
See,
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I don't feel beholden to anything at any point. I can freely move in and out of isms and stuff, but you can't talk about it if there's no terms. It's difficult to talk about. Like right now, I'm trying to resist the feeling of I'd love to throw out. There's so many terms we're not talking about. We're not talking about middle knowledge. We're not talking about all these different options. How God's predestination or inner sovereignty works with our free will, because I do think that's where the conversation ends up theologically. I'm resisting all that stuff, but I think it's important because I think it does say what you think about God. And I think the philosophies that you hold or subscribe to do affect people very powerfully. And the way you respond in grief will affect how someone else responds.
Yeah, but the question isn't how it affects other people. The question is, how does it affect us?
Okay, I'll just say this. I do think hardcore determinism, theologically speaking, helps us avoid grief. Helps us avoid the human condition.
Nobody can avoid grief.
No.
Yeah.
Like avoidance. You know the psychological term avoidance, where you're not actually
Right.
dealing with a problem, you're just shoving it into a different part of your experience and not dealing with your pain. I think that what happens with that is we create entire scenarios where people are pushed into avoiding their pain more than they are confronting it. And I think that happens.
Agreed. But they can use either philosophy to avoid that pain.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying,
but I'm not talking about the individual level. I'm talking about the philosophy itself.
I think the bigger thing at stake is what we tell people in those times.
Yeah, and that's what theology is. Honestly, that's all theology and philosophy is telling people the way that the world or God is in those situations. That's a big part of it.
That's not all it is, though.
I'm not saying that's all it is, but that's a big part of it. It's talking about God.
It's a big part
theology
of it.
Is talking about
pastor.
God. Yes or no? Theology is talking about God.
But as soon as you make a statement that's systematic or this is a thing, then you apply it. It no longer becomes something that can change.
That's not true. I think that we're maybe
it's not true for you, but it's true for me.
I feel like we're devolving into semantics.
Yeah. I feel like and I think that's important, sort of, in the sense that I'm totally fine with in one moment, maybe even like right now, being a determinist and walking out the doors of this bedroom/studio, and then totally 100% believing in free will because I have an interaction with one of my daughters.
I think it's a paradox.
I'm fine with it.
I think it's a paradox. I think it's like a quantum-esque paradox. You know how in quantum theory a wave and a particle can exist at the same time and are the same? Like they're in two simultaneous states at once. And I think this is very similar for me. Like we are both utterly determined and we have a lot more choice than we realize a lot of times. But that also is
there are
very
people that go that
world.
direction, and I think that avoids the philosophical question. But you're right. A lot of people do go that direction.
Wait, no, that's not what I was going to say. I was going to say I think that can be a very first world way to look at it, though, because opportunity and choice are really conditioned by your social location. And a lot of people in the world do not have free choice. They might have free will, but they don't have choice. And so they don't get to test their free will because there's no choice, you know? So I think a lot of it depends on the society in which we live.
So I think we can go around and around about this issue. Because I think we're kind of headed into that place. So let's do our takeaways or our answers to the question: does free will affect whatever the question is? What is the question?
Okay, so I heard.
Does our view and free will affect the way we live or interact?
I hear
with
a
the
different opinion than mine, but my opinion is that our convictions about our belief about free will absolutely does affect the way we live and the way we interact with each other and with God. Because I've seen that in my own life.
What do you think, Jeff?
I would say for some people, yes, and for some people, no. And that, do I believe it? Right now, I would probably lean towards no. But I'm open to yes.
You don't believe that it affects the way
I'm just saying yes and no. Like, honestly, I don't think I can feeling that I'm consistent with who I am and my personality to say yes or no, because it's so... I agree with everything that we've said here. Everything that we've said. Based off of certain circumstances and certain moments, depending upon where I've been. Because, Alan, the things you describe, I've been in those moments, and they've been super comforting. I've been in other moments where it hasn't been, and I had to change, and that became comforting. So I'm just saying that I am far more progressive than most people, and I'm just joking.
I think you're a functionalist, Jeff, is what it would be called.
Are you talking about... I'm sorry, we have to... I'm not completely clear. Are you talking about free will or about the effects of belief in free will? Because we're not talking about free will, right?
I'm talking about, do my beliefs in free will affect
the
world, right? Or affect us? And yes, it has. Okay. But right now it doesn't.
Got it.
And maybe tomorrow it will again.
So it can.
It can, but it can't.
This is Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that it is an interesting mental exercise to think through all this stuff. And I love thinking about this stuff. I think at the end of the day, when we're considering like right and just and loving courses of action in the world, you could say that if you figure out what is the most loving and just and right action at any single moment that you could conceive of in your imagination is also the will of God, because God is loving and just. Therefore, that has a component of determinism. I think that the dualism of that argument falls apart. It actually, at the end of the day, if you identify what is the most loving and right thing and what is the good, you can also argue that God has predetermined and foreknown it. So you can't, that's what we're getting at. You can't know. But I think the idea of living into our own freedom of imagination and exploring the good is more important than getting sidetracked by, is it determined or is it free will? I think focusing on our freedom to discern and to think and to churn on and to wrestle with what is the good is a more important vocation and use of our time.
That's well said.
Thanks.
I agree. Yeah, no, I think that's very well said.
Because hopefully it'll just line up with God's will if that's what you believe anyway.
Yeah, right? And I think that we're all coming from the perspective where we've all gone through for the most part, the deconstruction and the construction of this. But I would say that all of us, whenever we were in transition about whether we had free will or not, it was a struggle and it was difficult. And none of us mean to lighten that struggle, because it's real and it's difficult and we have to walk through it. But at the same time, I've worked really hard to be fine with, paradox and inconsistencies and tension in my life. But it was it was work, and it's still hard sometimes. But I think that in certain moments, it's a nice place to be.
I don't like it. I don't like paradox.
Why? There's some things that are unresolvable, though.
So at least working toward consistency is very important for me.
No,
Like, in a way,
paradox
a lot of
isn't
But to say that
inherently
I'm fine with
inconsistent.
paradox is not saying that I've given up.
Paradox is
Embrace
built into the
mystery.
fabric of our universe,
It-
Alan.
yeah, there's mystery
That
everywhere.
irreconcilably paradoxical, built into.
Well, the good thing is that
Everything.
on the other side of the music,
It's fantastic.
the segment will leave no room for paradox because we have to choose.
That's right.
Would you rather?
That was an excellent segue, Jeff.
Thank you.
You are the segue king.
All right. Well, obviously, we have a lot of opinions on this particular issue, so let us know what you think. If you have anything to add to the conversation, you can do that at Irenicast.com/53. That's Irenicast.com/53. There you also find helpful links that are related to this particular conversation. If you have anything not related to this conversation, you can contact us anytime at Irenicast.com/feedback. We welcome your questions, comments, and concerns for the show. So I think after the conversation we just had, this is perfect because we can leave with some closure. Would you rather this or this, black or white? We're going to make a definitive decision either way with no ambiguity.
I was going to say that was one of our most awkward conversations, so thank you all for sticking through it.
We had to parse it
I loved
afterward endlessly.
Yeah, we did have a long internal conversation about things.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, can I say the first would you rather? Or
Yes,
you want
please
to
do.
announce? Sorry, you're going to announce it. I stole your thunder.
We don't need to announce it. I think everyone knows the rules of this game.
Yep.
Would you rather?
give us two scenarios and we pick which one we would go with.
Okay.
Of our own
Are
free
you ready?
choice. Mm-hmm.
Okay, would you rather have fingers that look like hot dogs forever or have tears that are acidic?
I'm going to go with the fingers.
Easy.
You-
We're dude. Every dude. It's fine. Sausage fingers, no big deal. It's
Your fingers are
sexist.
like hot dogs.
Like
Like, your
do
fingers
they
are
taste
actually
like
like hot
hot dogs?
dogs.
Because I'll
No.
lick my fingers.
But they actually look like hot dogs, like in a freakish
Oh, like
way.
actual hot. Like what kind of hot dogs
Yes.
though? If it's like
Like hot dogs. Like
Like-
Oscar Mayer hot dogs.
okay, so
Are they
not
like Dodger dogs where they're like 4 feet long?
it's like a superpower.
You have hot dog fingers. No, we're not just talking like fingers that resemble hot dogs. We're talking about like fingers that really resemble hot dogs.
I'm going with the fingers still.
Me too.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
'cause
want
that
hot dog
doesn't hurt.
fingers.
Really? You would rather burn
Yeah.
your face every time you cry?
Yeah, I'll just force myself not
You
to
should
cry.
hold it in all the time.
You know what? If it was
That's funny.
3 years ago, I would go with the tears because I never cry. But now I cry all the time.
Oh,
Jeff, softy.
I'm so
because
glad you're in touch with your
That's
feelings.
so cool.
That makes,
Is it
that
because
makes
you
me
have
happy.
babies? Is that why?
It's their fault. It's
Aw.
the girl's fault. It's their fault. Like seriously, I cry at everything. I probably like twice a day.
Proud
it
of you,
feels like
Jeff.
sometimes.
Aw.
Proud of you. See, you used to laugh at me when I cried back in the day whenever I watched commercials at your house, but now you're in touch.
You're talking like this is a positive thing, and I'm not so sure.
It is. It's emotional intelligence. It's empathy, responding
Yeah.
to the world around you.
Crying
Breaking
doesn't
gender norms.
equal emotional intelligence or
You are
empathy.
a pioneer of masculinity. Jeff.
Shoving it all deep down inside doesn't equate to emotional intelligence. All right, here's mine. Ant. Would you rather be an ant, the animal, an ant, or a tree?
What the hell kind of
If you
question
were
is that?
forced right now to become one, which one would you be?
Tree. They will live way longer and they're majestic.
But you have
An
to
ant.
stand still
Because no
your
one
whole
will
life.
carve their initials into me.
That's like minor, but you get to house creatures
Aw.
amongst your branches.
You get to have a relationship with a small boy, and as he gets older, he keeps chopping little pieces of you off, and then eventually you're just a stump. You guys know.
So I
they
can
give
never
you-
have
you
some
got
time
to
to myself.
give.
There's always going to
But
be
you got
someone
to
living in
give.
my branches.
You'd have company.
But you'd have to stand still. You know what I mean? What if
Oh,
you're
yeah, I
like?
couldn't do that.
You
But an
literally
ant could be
don't-
smooshed.
Yeah, but an ant is like a superhero.
It is like a
super strong.
superhero.
What is it, like 50 times their own weight or
Mhm.
something?
But talk
Yeah,
about
they
no
sting
free
you.
choice. Like ants have to obey their leader. It's kind
Their
of
queen.
they're fascists. So wait, Jeff, you'd be an ant. Mona, you'd
Yeah.
be a tree. That's pretty awesome.
Absolutely a tree. Absolutely.
I would probably be an ant. Probably.
So far, our answers are walking a gender line.
Oh.
Let me see if I can break that up a little bit.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Would you rather travel in the past and meet your ancestors or travel to the future and meet your descendants?
Ooh, that's hard.
Didn't we have a
No.
question like that
The
last
question
time?
was, would you rather have a machine that can only go in the future or one that can only go in the past?
So how's
This
this
is different. Do you want to
Okay.
know where you're going or where you're coming from, specifically your family?
If you had a chance to meet your descendants or your ancestors, which one would you pick?
I'm not sure I'm going to have progeny, so I would
Let's just
say
assume you do.
ancestors.
Let's just assume you accidentally have
Yeah,
thousands.
No,
the
I don't
assumption
wanna
is you
assume I
will
have
have,
progeny.
you will
You're
have
like,
ancestors.
No, I don't want to assume that. It's weird.
you don't want the patriarchy to even have control over you, even in your mental exercises. That's
It's not necessarily patriarchal to have progeny.
wait, to have two men on a podcast telling you, yeah, you're gonna have kids in this scenario. You have kids right now.
Keep your hypothetical babies away from
Right.
me.
That's a hard one, Jeff. Honestly, that's really hard. Really difficult. I'm gonna say ancestors.
I'm going to say ancestors too, because it's kind of a closed loop. Like your descendants, like you could, have a future progeny that's an axe murderer or something, and I don't want to be disappointed.
That was the catalyst for me. I would go with ancestors
Really?
as well because
We
You
all
don't want to be
agree.
disappointed. Everyone's like, I just don't want to be disappointed in my kids. That's it.
well, not only that, but
if you pass on some
when I
weird
come
gene or
back,
virus?
it would affect every decision I make. Like I would live in constant anxiety of, well, can I change this? Can I do this? But if I just know the past where I came from, it would make my life now much more bearable.
Interesting. Okay. Would you rather win an Oscar for being Leonardo DiCaprio's butt double or win a Nobel Prize for curing cancer through poop research?
Easy.
Easy?
Nobel Prize.
You'd want to study poop your whole life.
No, I don't. Oh my gosh.
I think this is an easy one. I'm going with the butt double.
I'm gonna go with the cancer research.
Makes the assumption that I have a butt good enough to replace Leonardo DiCaprio.
I see. I would rather not have a good butt and study poop my whole life to actually bring good to the world. Other
That
than-
I would go with the Nobel Prize also, I think.
All right. Would you rather be your own parent? Like you have to parent yourself. Like your parent is you. You grow up your whole life with you as your parent. Or would you rather be your own kid?
So if I had a child, hypothetically speaking, and that child was me and my iteration, but then
yes.
I would be dissociated from myself
Yes.
as the child and only occupy
You would
the
only
space
have
of
your
the
own
parent.
experience, but the other thing would be you. So
This question doesn't make sense.
it does make sense, right?
No, it doesn't.
It made sense initially, but now that you've tried to explain it, I'm not so sure.
That's like our conversation. See? Free will.
Paradox,
is a paradox.
Alan.
Okay. Let's just break it down. Would you rather have a parent like you or a kid like you?
Okay, so that's a different question.
Oh,
I can get with that
okay.
one.
It's like the same
Okay.
thing. Would
Yeah.
would you like to have a parent that was exactly like you or a kid that was exactly like you?
I think I'd be a fun parent, but I'd also be a fun child.
Right? So it's a hard
Yeah.
question. Which one?
Yeah.
That's an easy one. Because I parented myself, it would be nice to have a parent with my sensibility. So I'm going to go
Good.
with a parent.
Me too. I'd like to have a parent like me, even though both my parents were amazing.
My mother tells me all the time I'm a blessing and a joy, so I think I would be a good child with somebody. She does. She tells me that all the time. She's my only fan.
Okay, so my last one is, would you rather have no one show up to your wedding or no one show up to your funeral?
Easy wedding. No, funeral. I'm not going to be there.
She's all easy. I'm going to go with funeral because I'm not going to be there. Yeah.
Oh, see? I disagree wholeheartedly. I'm saying wedding.
For some reason, nobody showing up to your funeral says something about like your character as a person.
Yeah. And I'm in this scenario, I'm going with the possibility that you get to
Interesting.
look down on the funeral from heaven.
Sure.
And I'd like to see that.
So you're right. I don't care what people say about me. I care that people are involved in the joys of my life. You know what I mean?
No, I care what people say.
I don't care what people think about me at the end of my funeral.
To me, a wedding is socially exhausting. You have to talk to all these people you barely know,
oh
and
my
they're
gosh,
saying all
it
these
was so much
platitudes.
Weddings are
fun,
so
man.
dumb.
No, they're so fun. This is like
Alan,
greatest
your wedding
time.
was amazing.
Probably
I
the
do have
greatest
to
time in
say.
my life was when U2 was playing the sweetest thing when we were cutting our cake. I was like looking out at like 230 people of people that I absolutely dearly loved. Oh, so wonderful.
All right, well, I think that'll do it for us this week. If you enjoyed what you hear and you want to support the show, you can go see all the ways to do that at irenicast.com/support. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm an ant with sausage fingers.
Thanks for joining the conversation. That was...
And you're a tree that is your own kid.
No, I went with ant. I was talking ant sausage fingers.
That was a good way to wrap up that one. All right, I gotta go, kids.
See
All right.
ya.
See y'all later.
Adios.
Peace.